Got a great question recently from one of the trainers going through our functional aging specialist certification from New Zealand. And I thought the question was so good, I wanted to really share it with you. Her question was, how do I cue abdominal bracing for mature adults? This is an issue that I've had for a number of years. And so I've tried to develop a strategy that I think works really well for this population. First, let's kind of talk about what is abdominal bracing? Well, it's a technique promoted by Dr. Stuart McGill, who's at the University of Waterloo in Canada, an expert on spinal rehab, spinal performance. And so it's a technique that we try to teach all of our clients so that they can support the spine so it doesn't move around in any direction while they're doing functional movements or any lifting movements or reaching movements, whatever it might be. So abdominal bracing is getting all the abdominal muscles to contract kind of simultaneously and rather bind together to create a stiffness of the spine. And it's what Dr. McGill would call super stiffness, so that you are stiff in any direction, so that you're not getting any sort of flexion, extension, lateral flexion that's going on when you're pulling or reaching or doing other movements. So the question is, how do you teach people to do this when now that they're older, they've been inactive for a long period of time, they don't even really know how to contract their abdominal muscles. They don't kind of even know that they're there. So how do I get them to perform this bracing technique? Well, if I'm working with a younger client, then typically I can just kind of palpate them and say, okay, I want you to brace your abdominal muscles, and so I'm going to poke in a little bit on them. I'm going to use that same palpation technique with an older client, but the key difference is I can't just expect them to be able to control those abdominal muscles and get them to contract. And so what I need to do is I actually need to create a moment, a torque moment on their body. What that means is that I need to push on them, and so that they have to resist against that force, and therefore they will then contract those muscles. So where I like to start is have the person get in a comfortable upright stance, shoulder width stance, get a good upright posture. Then I'm going to get beside them and I'm going to push on their shoulder like I'm trying to push them over from the side. But I'm going to tell them, I'm going to push on your shoulder and I don't want you to move. Okay, I want you to try to stay upright and stiff. So then when I push on them from the side, obviously that's trying to push them over, and they're going to have to then contract these lateral abdominal muscles in order to remain upright. And so as I'm pushing on them, they contract those muscles, and now I can poke into those muscles, right? I can palpate. I can say, you feel those muscles contracting right there? And that kind of a light bulb goes off, like, oh yeah, I can feel that now. Okay? And then I push from the other side, and we get the other side active. And so now that gets them to start thinking about, okay, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about these muscles activating, and because I pushed on them and created this moment, they gave them something to resist against to activate those muscles, instead of just standing here and saying, okay, contract. Okay? So then you can do that from the front. Now, if you do it from the front, in order to activate rectus, a couple things to keep in mind. You probably want to put them into a split or a staggered stance so that one foot is in front of the other, because otherwise you're probably just going to push them over pretty easily. So get them in a staggered stance just to create a good, nice anterior posterior stable base. Then you're just going to push it on them from the shoulders. So you can just push into the shoulders, both sides. And again, tell them the same thing. I want you to contract against my pushing so that you stay in a good upright posture. Don't let me push you backwards. However, the thing about the rectus abdominis is that usually it's a little more active than it should be anyway. So it's often difficult because now we're trying to feed into a system that's already active. So what you have to watch for is when you push on them, the tendency that everybody has is, instead of just remaining in an upright posture, they actually flex forward. They push into you and flex forward, and they'll even move their pelvis, right? They'll perform a pelvic tilt against it. Now they're in flexion. You don't want them to be in flexion. You want them to be in spinal neutral and remain in spinal neutral. So you want to make sure that you cue them appropriately and telling them those things, that when I push on you, I don't want you to try to lean forward, don't try to change your body position, just resist against me. And again, you're going to palpate those muscles. As you kind of go through that process several times, and now they start to understand what you're talking about, okay, then they'll start to be able to contract those muscles on their own, just voluntarily. and then you can palpate them. It really helps that if you palpate with your fingers and it almost make it kind of painful. So that if they're trying to contract, you literally reach around their sides and you're poking into their trunk. And that poking in is not very comfortable, and they want to try to keep that poking out, so they naturally will contract against that. So the torque moment and that hard palpation are both two good techniques to get them to understand how to brace. Now, once they're able to brace in neutral, now you can get them to brace in maybe some different positions, right? You can teach them how to hip hinge and what that means. But also, you can look at performing exercises in spinal neutral, in standing, that will then just cause them to contract as well. So we like to do standing rows, right? If we're doing standing rows, either 2-arm or 1-arm rows, or 2-arm or 1-arm chest presses, again from a standing position. That is engaging that core musculature. In order to remain in spinal neutral in a good upright position, they've got to contract. And so while they're doing that exercise, you can reinforce the abdominal contraction and the bracing, again, by palpating. So you're palpating while they're standing there, you're palpating while you're pushing on them, you're palpating while they're doing presses and rows and other upper body movements in a standing position. Again, always monitoring spinal neutral, helping them to stay in spinal neutral. So I hope these tips are helpful for you as you try to teach your older clients how to brace properly and effectively.